So now let's talk about my favorite part of PI planning, and that is the team breakouts. There's in the typical scaled agile agenda here, there's a 3 hour breakout on day one and a 2 hour breakout on day two. And I love these breakouts because the energy and enthusiasm people have and the problem solving that takes place, it makes sense. Why not bring the whole team together and let them work face to face? How, it's a very simple idea and yet it's very, very powerful. And I've been on many of these and they're wonderful and they're exciting. So let's take a closer look at the team breakout. On the first day, it's 3 hours. On the second day, it's 2 hours. The way that they're structured, you'll notice here that there is basically time boxing taking place. The intent is to create a forcing function that gets the team working towards a plan. So, for example, after the first hour in the working session, there's a scrum of scrums where the scrum masters from each of the team get together and go through a progress checklist. Are they making progress towards getting a plan? And you see then we have the second hour, and then the scrum masters get together again for a quote scrum of scrums to make sure that we are effectively making progress. And of course, all the rules that you've come to know and love about removing impediments come into play. The scrum masters having to work with other teams or maybe going to management to get help because somebody's getting stuck. But the intent here, as you can see, there is time boxing and there is a structure for checkpointing to make sure that we are making progress, and that also as impediments come up, we can raise them with management and try to resolve them. The intent is that at the end of the first day, after about 3 hours, we will have a draft plan that we can present at the end of the day. So what does the team PI plan look like? Well, if you're, again, following sort of the standard safe recommendations, you're going to have 4 sprints. So you'll see here, for example, we have sprint 1, sprint 2, sprint 3 sort of laid out. Doesn't mean we're committing to these sprints. It just means we use these to assemble a plan to see if we can reach these PI objectives. And also we have risks. So what you will see when teams first come into PI planning is generally they will take about 6 or 7 sheets of sticky flip chart, put it up on a wall, label 1 PI objectives, 1 risks, and then 1 sheet for each sprint that they're planning with. So that's kind of what you see when you walk into a room where PI planning is taking place. Now, you'll probably notice there's a little bit of a color code. And a recommendation that you see sometimes is that you would use green sticky notes for a classical user story. So this is something that represents direct business value to your product owners or the business owners. Yellow is for spikes where, well, we have a question or there's some uncertainty, and let's just try and implement something to get an answer to that question. Orange would represent architectural or infrastructure. So these are things that enable value. It's not necessarily a direct business value, but this is something we have to build as part of our architectural runway to allow us to evolve value. And then there's purple, which is, are we going to put aside any time or effort to refactor, to do maintenance, to pay down our debt that we've been accumulating? And finally, what doesn't show up on the sprints themselves, but on the risk sheet, are these nice red post-it notes that represent risks, things that threaten our ability to deliver value. So that's kind of the color code. The other thing, just as a sort of a tangent here, you'll notice kind of the way that we've drawn the sprints and the cards on them. You can see in the first sprint there, sprint 1, we've got the stories there, the post-it notes are kind of small. In other words, they're sort of representing that these are fine-grained user stories, and we have a couple of spikes in there because there's probably some questions we need to get answered. And there's also some infrastructure work. Now, as we go into sprint 2, you'll notice that the user stories are kind of much larger, right? Because sprint 2 is a little bit further out in the future. So we don't necessarily have to have the stories nice and small and fine-grained, like stories that can be done every few days. These might be bigger stories. We haven't quite yet fully analyzed them. We can size them. We kind of know that they fit into that sprint, but we haven't necessarily broken them down into really fine-grained stories. And you'll see we still have a little bit of architecture work. As we're getting out to the later PIs, again, we're having fewer fine-grained stories. We have just simply some larger stories. And by the time we get to sprint 4, we don't have any infrastructure work. There are no spikes. We just have a couple of big stories there. We know they fit, but we haven't done the work. We haven't done the story time or backlog grooming necessary yet to refine them down into small stories. Again, we don't want to overly plan either. What we're trying to do here, remember in sprint planning, is we're just trying to see if we can assemble a reasonable plan for the next 2 months that will help us, that will get us towards our PI objectives. Is there a plan that will get us there? Now, the plan may change. I mean, after all, 2 months is a long time, so it's just something to keep in mind. So you see sprint 1, very fine-grained stories, because, well, as soon as we finish PI planning, boom, we're going to start sprinting. But, as we look further out into the future, risks, uncertainty make things a little bit hazier, so not so fine-grained. And after all, remember, in PI planning, we are not committing to the specific sprint and sprint plans. Our commitment will be to the objectives. Can we deliver on those objectives? So in the breakout session, what we're effectively doing is we're pulling work from our program backlog and just allocating them to sprints. We're trying to assemble a plan that will help us reach our objectives. So where should this story go? Does it need to be split? Should we do it earlier? These are the kind of questions the team is asking. And what can influence that as well is the program board, because it's one thing for a story to be completely independent and a team not have any dependencies in other teams, but one of the reasons we get together in PI planning is we acknowledge that we have dependencies. For example, here, as we pull a story, we may realize that, the Jaguars here, who have a story that they want to work on, it has a dependency on some infrastructure work that the Panthers are doing. So on the program board, we would have our little conversation with the Panthers saying, are you going to be doing that story in sprint 1? And they're saying, yes, we will. And then, so we would go to the program board with them and we would fill it out like this to show, yes, the Panthers have a story, an infrastructure story they're working on in sprint 1. And then in sprint 2, we will be able to implement our story. And we have a dependency. And that's what that red string there is meant to show. The dependency between the Jaguar story in sprint 2 and the Panthers story in sprint 1. And this might continue on. You can see here that to deliver that feature in sprint 3, it depends on the Jaguar story and also on a story that the Cheetahs are doing, which apparently doesn't depend on anything else itself. So the program board is meant to show the dependencies between teams. And, it's the more dependencies, just as a word of thought aside here, the more dependencies here, the more coordination overhead we're going to have, right? Because we have to be able to negotiate. And if the Panthers slip, this could slip a lot of things. So this is the kind of thing we want to be able to keep track of and see if there's means of reducing those dependencies or mitigate those dependencies. Because, you saw this previously. This board here is starting to look a little scary, in my opinion. It's making the dependencies visible. This is really important. And also kind of telling you how complex those dependencies are. And also remember, not all dependencies are simply between stories. There's also people. For example, a lot of organizations are specialized skills that you may be dependent on, that they have to perform an activity. So these are the kind of things you may also want to track in your program board. Think, for example, your UX people, architecture, security, DBA, people that you normally would not put on a team because they're very specialized and they cut across all teams, yet they're very much a constrained resource. So just something to think about when you're doing your planning, making sure that you can reduce the coordination overhead, because quite simply, my observation has been in most teams, huge amounts of time are wasted trying to coordinate between teams and chase down resources that are constrained. Finally, we build up the PI objectives. Now, this is something that causes people a lot of confusion because your conventional wisdom is that you think, well, objectives is something we're trying to build a plan towards to reach, where in fact the view that we're taking or the way that we're working in SAFE is that we're building out a plan that, the business owners and program managers that came in, well, here's our top 10 features we want to have, and this is when we want to do releases. So each team is building out their plan here, sprint 1, sprint 2, sprint 3, sprint 4, to see if they can reach that. And from there, we build up the objectives from that. So it's not the objectives worked down and we try to lay out all our stories to reach those objectives. In fact, the stories that we're putting together to reach the features and releases that we were asked to, those form the objectives. So it's kind of turning the idea of the objectives on its head. But again, the idea is we're building up the objectives from the plan here. And again, you can see we have the objectives we're going to be committing to, and then also the stretch objectives, the things that would be nice to have if everything breaks well for us. And each team builds up their own PI objectives, and then those are all rolled up into the common program PI objectives. So each team will have their objective, and then those are consolidated into the PI objectives for the entire program. So risks is one of the other pieces of the puzzle here. So what we've done is we've come up with our plan, we have our program board, we also want to get our risks here, and there are things, as we put our plans together, there's uncertainties. For example, a good indicator of the uncertainty is like when we have to run a spike, because a spike is asking a question. Can we do this? That could reflect a risk. And so we may capture that also as a risk. This spike is trying to tell us whether the performance of our system will meet the specifications of, well, that's a risk. What if it doesn't? Okay, what are we going to do about it? Or availability, or will a database engine work for us? So those are we're trying to collect up the risks such that we can make it explicit the kind of things that would threaten us from being able to reach our objectives for this PI.